When you first hear that Rachel Zegler, a Latina actress, was cast as Snow White, it might strike you as Disney's attempt to modernize and diversify a beloved classic. On the surface, this seems like a progressive move, one that could represent a new era of inclusion in Hollywood. But if you followed the public reaction, you'd know that it wasn't that simple. Many fans praised the casting as a step forward, celebrating the idea of breaking away from the traditionally Eurocentric mold of fairy tale characters. But others saw it differently. They felt that changing Snow White's ethnicity while still calling her Snow White, a character whose name is explicitly linked to her skin white as snow, was inconsistent and confusing. You may have seen people on social media questioning whether it was really necessary to change the identity of the character, or whether Disney was just checking a diversity box without truly adapting the story to match. Instead of crafting a new fairy tale with a fresh narrative, Disney seemed to be inserting modern values into a framework built in the 1930s, and that tension created division. As a viewer, you might have found yourself torn, appreciating the intent behind the casting.
Hi, Vanity Fair. Jacob and I are really nervous backstage, and Beyonce's
Add a little pizzazz, little razzle dazzle in there. Yeah, that's
we act, damn it. We have to act.
Let me show you how it's done.
Hey, Vanity Fair. I am shaking in my boots.
While also sensing a disconnect between the character's origin and this new version, some argued that Disney could have created an entirely new princess of Latina heritage instead of retrofitting Snow White, while others defended the casting choice as a natural evolution of storytelling. In the middle of all this, Rachel Zegler became the face of the controversy. Whether she wanted to or not, she was thrust into a larger cultural debate that went far beyond her performance. From the moment her casting was announced, the pressure was on, and it only got more. You probably didn't expect Peter Dinklage to become one of the most pivotal figures in the Snow White controversy, but his comments changed the entire trajectory of the film's production. When you hear someone like Dinklage, a respected actor and outspoken advocate for people with dwarfism, speak out, you tend to listen. And that's exactly what Disney and the public did. In a podcast interview, Dinklage criticized Disney's decision to remake Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, calling it hypocritical. He pointed out the irony of Disney celebrating diversity by casting a Latina lead while still choosing to tell a story that, in his eyes, perpetuated outdated and offensive tropes about dwarfism. To Dinklage, the image of seven dwarfs living in a cave seemed regressive. He called out what he perceived as fake progressivism, accusing the studio of patting itself on the back for casting Ziegler, while ignoring deeper issues in the narrative. You might see where he was coming from, especially if you're aware of how often people with dwarfism have been caricatured in media. His perspective was that real progress would have involved rethinking the story entirely, not just switching up the ethnicity of the lead, while keeping the same problematic elements in place. But Dinklage's critique wasn't universally accepted. As you looked online, you saw the backlash. Many in the dwarf acting community felt betrayed. Some, like Dylan Postal, better known as Deb Hornswoggle, openly criticized Dinklage for speaking on behalf of an entire group. They argued that opportunities for actors with dwarfism are already scarce, and this film could have provided meaningful roles. To them, Dinklage's well-intentioned comments had unintended consequences, possibly costing them work and visibility. In essence, Dinklage's words sparked a domino effect. His statement wasn't just a critique, it became a catalyst. It ignited debates, fueled rewrites, and turned a straightforward remake into a battleground over representation, sensitivity, and who gets to define progress. Whether you agree with him or not, you can't deny the ripple effect his remarks had, not just on the film, but on the broader conversation about how Hollywood navigates inclusivity. When Peter Dinklage's comments went viral, you might have expected Disney to stay the course and simply clarify its vision, but that's not what happened. Instead, the studio appeared to panic. Suddenly, the entire framework of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a story that has existed since 1937, was on the chopping block. You could feel the shift almost immediately. What had been marketed as a modern, empowering retelling of a timeless fairy tale began to morph into something unrecognizable. Rather than standing firm in their original creative direction or thoughtfully evolving the story, Disney chose to drastically rewrite large parts of the film. The iconic Seven Dwarfs were reportedly replaced with a group of diverse magical creatures, and only one actual dwarf actor remained in the ensemble. As a viewer, you may have found this change disorienting. It wasn't clear whether the studio was trying to honor the original or avoid controversy altogether. The result? A story that seemed directionless, trying to be everything to everyone, but satisfying no one in the process. Behind the scenes, reports suggested that these changes were driven by a frantic need to avoid further criticism, especially from advocacy groups and social media discourse. If you were following industry gossip, you might have heard that the creative team was in disarray, constantly revising the script to stay ahead of public perception. And with each rewrite, the tone of the film shifted, veering between nostalgic homage and overly modernized messaging. The movie was no longer being created with a clear artistic vision, but rather sculpted in real time by public outrage and fear of offending anyone. From the moment controversy ignited around Snow White, Rachel Zegler found herself trapped in the middle of a storm she didn't start, and possibly couldn't stop. As the face of the film, you saw her name in every headline, not because of something she did directly, but because she had become the symbol of everything the movie was trying, and failing, to modernize. When the narrative began shifting due to Peter Dinklage's comments and Disney's reactive rewrites, Zegler was left trying to maintain composure in a project that no longer resembled the one she'd originally signed on for. What makes this situation especially complex is that Zegler reportedly remained silent for most of it. From your point of view, this may have seemed strategic. Maybe she was contractually obligated to avoid public commentary. But silence, especially in a scandal, is often filled by speculation. Soon, rumors emerged that Zegler was frustrated behind the scenes. Whispers suggested that she blamed Dinklage for sparking the chain reaction that led to rushed changes, creative confusion, and a final product that made her look inconsistent or miscast. For someone relatively new to the spotlight, this kind of public scrutiny can be brutal. You watched as every Zegler interview, every social media post, was dissected for hidden meaning. Was she taking shots at Dinklage? Was she shading Disney? The lack of clarity only fueled more online chaos. And through it all, she was being held accountable for a film whose flaws stretched far beyond her performance. You couldn't help but notice that Zegler, despite doing what most actors would, staying out of corporate decisions, was treated as the lightning rod for backlash. Whether fair or not, she became the face of a failing project that was now associated more with controversy than creativity. And as the rumors of her private frustrations with Dinklage grew louder, the divide between performance and perception only deepened. If you've ever watched a movie and felt like it didn't quite know what it wanted to be, then you already understand what audiences reportedly experienced with Snow White. Behind the curtain, the production was said to be in shambles. Constant rewrites, uncertain direction, and tension between studio heads and creatives. You likely saw this reflected in the leaked test screening reactions. Viewers described a jarring, disjointed film where tone, pacing, and messaging seemed to clash with each other instead of flow together. From an insider's perspective, things were not smooth. Rumors suggested that the script was being updated so frequently that actors didn't have time to build cohesive arcs. Imagine trying to perform a lead role in a story that keeps changing. One day you're playing a classic princess, the next you're championing modern ideals in a way that feels forced. That was reportedly Zegler's reality. Scenes were added or removed in response to online reactions, and no one seemed to agree on how to portray the dwarfs, or if they should appear at all. There was also creative division behind the scenes. Some team members pushed for staying true to the original Disney magic, while others were determined to reshape the narrative around 2020's sensibilities. You could see how these competing visions created a tug of war. In the rush to make the film more inclusive and socially conscious, the heart of the fairy tale seemed to get lost. By the time editing began, the chaos had already left its mark. Reports emerged that the movie felt like a patchwork of ideas, some grounded in nostalgia, others shoehorned in to make statements. What you ended up with was a film unsure of itself, trying to do too much with too little coherence. The audience felt that, and so did critics. Once a film is labeled a disaster in the public eye, it's nearly impossible to shake. That's exactly what happened with Snow White, and you saw it unfold in real time. The Snow White disaster wasn't just a dramatic nickname, it became the dominant narrative. The moment fans and media latched onto that phrase, the movie lost its ability to redeem itself. Every teaser, every interview, every public appearance by Zegler or anyone else involved was filtered through that label. You probably noticed how polarized the reactions were. On one side, you had fans who blamed Peter Dinklage for speaking out too soon and too loudly. They argued that his commentary derailed the film before it had a chance, causing the studio to spiral into fear-based decisions. On the other side, There were defenders of Dinklage who believed his critique was necessary and brave, calling out a legacy of stereotypical portrayals that should no longer fly in modern storytelling. What made this particularly damaging was Disney's inability to steer the ship. Each attempt to reclaim the narrative only deepened the confusion. Removing the dwarfs, softening Snow White's romance arc, and injecting heavy-handed modern themes all seemed like overcorrections. To viewers like you, it felt less like a movie and more like a political statement, one that wasn't entirely sure what it was trying to say. Zegler, meanwhile, became the public scapegoat. She was either too outspoken or too silent, too modern or too traditional. The nuance of her situation was lost, and the internet's appetite for a villain ensured she bore much of the blame. Even if you sympathized with her, it was hard not to see her name tangled up in every headline. As things escalated, the criticism eventually shifted beyond Zegler and Dinklage and landed squarely on Disney itself. If you were watching closely, you saw the sentiment grow. Disney had lost its touch. What once felt like magical reimaginings of beloved classics now seemed more like corporate experiments in wokeness, often lacking the heart and charm that made the originals so enduring. Snow White became the ultimate example of how not to modernize a fairy tale. Audiences, and even some longtime fans of Disney, began expressing fatigue. You may have seen it in comment sections or movie forums, people asking why every classic needed to be reworked, especially if the changes weren't improving the story. Disney's live-action strategy, once a lucrative formula, was now under scrutiny. The company wasn't just accused of poor storytelling, it was being seen as tone-deaf, reactive, and out of touch with what audiences actually wanted. For dwarf actors, Disney's choice to reduce the presence of actual dwarfs in the film was especially frustrating. Rather than offering representation, the studio appeared to sideline a community that already struggles for visibility. Dinklage's critique had drawn attention to the issue, but Disney's response, removing most dwarf roles, was seen by many as swinging the pendulum too far in the other direction. You could tell the backlash wasn't just about one film, it was about a growing distrust in Disney's judgment. The brand's decisions, once assumed to be carefully curated, now looked rushed and reactive. And when whispers of a reboot or alternate version of Snow White surfaced, possibly with a new cast and director, it felt like Disney was acknowledging, even if unofficially, that this version had failed to meet expectations. At that point, the backlash was no longer just loud, it was widespread. And for many, it raised an uncomfortable question. If Disney can't get Snow White right, what does that say about its future